I haven't always played the good hero, but usually I try to find a way in which I can imagine myself in the same situation.
You think you know John Wayne, the cowboy, the war hero, the unshakable American icon. For decades, his image stood tall, clean, bold, and carved in stone. But what if that image was never the full story? What if one rare interview, hidden in archives, passed over by casual fans and whispered about by diehards, said everything without ever meaning to? A few offhand comments, a quiet moment, a slip of the mask. That was all it took. At first, nobody noticed. Then someone looked again. And once you hear what was said, you cannot unhear it, because this was not the John Wayne you remember. It was just another interview, or at least, that is what everyone thought. John Wayne had sat across from journalists hundreds of times before. He knew how to hold a room, how to command attention without raising his voice. These interviews usually followed the same script. A few questions about his latest film, a nod to American values, maybe a story from the set, polished, respectful, predictable. But this one felt different. There was something in the air, or maybe in his eyes, a weight behind his answers that did not sit quite right. At first, the questions were routine, but the longer it went on, the more it shifted. Wayne's posture changed. His tone dipped. He did not smile much. He was not performing. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But for the few who were really paying attention, the cracks began to show. He started talking about the past, not the proud stories, but the personal ones, things he had never said before. Not big reveals, not scandals, just honesty. The kind that makes people uncomfortable. For years, the interview sat quietly in an archive. Most fans never even heard about it. It was never replayed on television. Clips were never used in retrospectives. Even film historians glossed over it, calling it uneventful or standard. But then, years later, someone uploaded a few short clips online, and everything changed. Suddenly, fans were divided. Some saw strength in what he said. Others saw arrogance. Some believed he was finally being himself. Others said he should have never let his guard down. And then came the questions. Why was this interview never talked about? Why was it pushed aside? Was it buried or just forgotten? What John Wayne said that day was not loud or explosive. It was quiet, measured, but it left an imprint. It felt like something had shifted, like the myth had slipped, just for a moment. And what he revealed in the minutes that followed was only the beginning. To most of the world, John Wayne was not just a movie star. He was a symbol carved into American identity, a towering figure who stood for rugged independence, for stoicism, for doing what was right, no matter the cost. His very presence on screen became shorthand for strength and certainty. But the man behind the myth? He was far more complicated. Born Marion Robert Morrison in Winterset, Iowa, in 1907, he grew up not on a dusty ranch, but in a modest home with dreams of becoming a football player. His family moved west to California when he was a boy, and it was there, long before the cowboy hat and boots, that he faced his first real heartbreak. A body blow in the form of a surfing injury shattered his athletic career and crushed his scholarship dreams. It was not bravery or ambition that pushed him toward acting, it was necessity. A job moving props on a film set, a director who saw his jawline, a lucky break. That is how John Wayne was born, not in a barn under western skies, but in the cold machinery of the studio system. And from that moment on, Marion Morrison began to disappear. Hollywood gave him a new name, a new image, a new set of expectations. He was no longer allowed to be unsure or vulnerable. The studios crafted him into something audiences could believe in, the ultimate man's man. And the truth? He leaned into it. He embraced the role. But deep down, it wore on him. Close friends and co-stars described a man who, in private, could be quiet, even brooding. He read poetry. He enjoyed solitude. He often talked about how the persona had taken over the man, that the line between who he was and who the world saw had blurred beyond recognition. That rare interview captured something few had ever seen. Not a confession, but a man circling something he had carried for decades. There was a hesitation in his voice, a moment where his face tightened and the room seemed to hold its breath. He said, "Sometimes I think I played that character for so long, I forgot who I was before the cameras started rolling." And that is when people started to realize this was not the same John Wayne they thought they knew. What came next peeled the curtain back even further. If there was one place John Wayne never backed down from, it was behind the scenes. While millions admired him for his roles on screen, those who worked with him, directors, producers, co-stars, often saw another side. A version of the Duke who was just as forceful off-camera as he was in front of it. Maybe even more. Wayne had built his career from the ground up. He had fought for recognition, for respect, for every inch of ground he gained in a ruthless industry. So by the time he was a household name, he no longer asked for control. He expected it. He did not take orders easily, especially not from studio executives who, in his mind, had never spent a day in the dust and heat of a real film set. He rewrote dialogue mid-shoot. He argued over costumes. He refused scenes that showed his characters in ways he thought were weak, confused, or indecisive. "The audience does not want to see me cry," he reportedly said once. "They want to see me try not to." Some called it professionalism. Others called it domination. And the truth probably lived somewhere in between. Stories from set paint a complicated portrait. On one film, he reportedly walked off the lot for 2 days because he disagreed with the script's tone. On another, he demanded a co-star be replaced after a single table read. Sometimes he was right, sometimes he was not, but few dared to challenge him once his boots were on set. Actors who were young or idealistic often found themselves steamrolled. One recalled asking Wayne for a second take to explore a more emotional reading of a scene, only to be met with a flat stare and the words, "Kid, we are not making art here. We are making truth that sells." It was not just blunt, it was final, but it was not all hard edges. Some crew members described Wayne as fiercely loyal, the kind of man who remembered names, asked about families, and personally made sure people got paid what they deserved. He could be gruff, but if you earned his respect, he treated you like family. And that rare interview, it peeled back the curtain on all of this. For a moment, he stopped defending. He stopped performing. He admitted that maybe, just maybe, he had let his pride get in the way more than once. That there were times he had pushed people too far. That being the Duke meant winning, even when he was wrong. It was not an apology, not exactly, but it was a glimpse into something very few had ever seen. A man who, for the first time, was not entirely sure if all the battles had been worth it. And then, with almost no warning, he said something that left the interviewers speechless. John Wayne was not the kind of man who dwelled on the past, at least not publicly. He built a legacy on forward motion, the man who never looked back, never wavered, never second-guessed a decision once it was made. His characters did not ask for forgiveness. They rode into the sunset, right or wrong. And for most of his life, Wayne lived the same way. But behind the scenes, that was not the full truth. That rare interview, the one few fans ever saw, revealed something far more human. Not in what he said directly, but in the silences between his words. He paused more than usual. His sentences did not always land clean, and in those quiet spaces, a different picture began to form. He did not list regrets the way someone might confess sins. That was not his style, but he hinted, he reflected, he let just enough truth slip through the cracks to make it clear that the weight of certain choices had never fully left him. His family life, for starters, was far from simple. 3 marriages, each ending with distance and disappointment. Long months away on set, missed birthdays, conversations that never happened. His children respected him, but some admitted later that they barely knew him. He was a giant in the world, one of his sons said, but not always in the living room. He spoke briefly about that in the interview, just a passing mention of things he could have handled better. It was the only time his voice almost cracked. There were also regrets tied to fame itself. Wayne had become so tightly linked to a very specific idea of masculinity that, over time, it trapped him. He could not change. He could not evolve, even when he wanted to. At one point in the interview, he lowered his eyes and said, "They wanted the Duke. Every room I walked into, I had to be him, even when I was not." It was not bitterness. It was exhaustion. After decades of carrying that image through film sets, interviews, public appearances, even hospital beds, he had come to realize how much of himself had been lost along the way. And then there was his health. He had already battled cancer once. The treatments had been brutal. He had survived, barely, and worn the scars with quiet dignity. But the illness came back later in life, more aggressive, more cruel. And though he never let the public see it, those close to him said it shook him. He began to talk more softly. He wrote more letters. And in that interview, he said something that stuck with anyone who watched the footage closely. "I just hope I did more good than harm." It was not the kind of line you expect from a man like John Wayne, but that was the point. The man who had carried generations on his back had a burden of his own. And just when it seemed he had revealed his deepest truth, the conversation turned again. You would think a man like John Wayne only surrounded himself with people who looked like him, thought like him, acted like him, tough, commanding, larger than life. And in some cases, that was true. But the relationships he held closest were often the ones no one expected. Take Maureen O'Hara, for instance. Their chemistry on screen was lightning in a bottle, full of fire, conflict, and unspoken affection. Off-screen, it was just as real, but far more respectful. They joked like siblings. They confided in one another during long, exhausting filming days. She was one of the few people who could argue with him and win. When asked about her years later, O'Hara said, "He never treated me like a woman. He treated me like his equal." And that meant more than anyone realized. But it was not just co-stars. Wayne formed unlikely bonds with younger actors, especially those struggling to find their place in Hollywood. He would offer advice that could be blunt, even brutal, but it came from a place of recognition. He knew what it felt like to be overlooked. He had not forgotten the sting of early failure. One actor recalled being pulled aside by Wayne after a tough shoot. "You are not here to look good," he told him. "You are here to tell the truth, even if you do not like it." That stuck with him for life. Behind the camera, Wayne was fiercely loyal to his crew. He remembered names. He shook hands. He handed out envelopes at the end of shoots, cash bonuses for the grips, set builders, the drivers. Not for attention, not for praise, just because he believed they deserved it. One story involved a lighting technician who was nearly let go due to budget cuts. Wayne stepped in and said, "If he goes, I go." The man stayed. But perhaps the most surprising relationships were the ones he formed with people who challenged him. Journalists, critics, even political opposites. He respected sharp minds, even if they disagreed with him publicly. In fact, when asked during that interview who had made the biggest impression on him outside of the film world, he named a journalist who had written a scathing column about him years prior. "He told the truth as he saw it," Wayne said. "I did not like it, but I never forgot it." There was complexity in that answer, a kind of grace that caught viewers off guard. And then, near the end of the interview, the conversation shifted to legacy, to how he wanted to be remembered. And once again, his answer was not what anyone expected. It is strange how a quiet interview, nearly forgotten, barely circulated, never aired in full, can come back decades later and feel louder than ever. And yet, that is exactly what happened with John Wayne's rarest, rawest moment on camera. It was not supposed to be groundbreaking. It was not taped for prime time. There was no press tour, no grand premiere. It was just a conversation, one that sat in the archives for years, gathering dust, until someone unearthed a clip and shared it online. At first, it barely made a ripple, but then the clip spread, passed from fan pages to film forums to curious TikTok creators who had never seen a Wayne film in their lives. And slowly, something odd happened. people started listening, not to the myth, but to the man. What shocked viewers was not any one quote, it was the tone, the stillness, the way he hesitated before answering, how his voice dipped when asked about the cost of fame. For a figure so often painted in black and white, that one interview introduced shades of gray. New generations, those raised long after the westerns faded from network television, were seeing him for the first time. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a person who seemed caught between his image and his truth. Some found the interview inspiring, others found it disappointing, but very few walked away unmoved. Academics started referencing it in discussions about masculinity. Cultural critics dissected his answers, comparing them to public figures today. Fans wrote essays, shared their reflections, and admitted, in their own words, that the conversation had shifted how they viewed not just Wayne, but fame itself. And then there were the people who knew him personally. Many of them never commented when the clip went viral, but a few quietly admitted they had never seen that side of him before, not in decades of working together. The interview became more than a moment. It became a mirror, not just for how we see our icons, but for how we flatten people into symbols without ever asking who they were when the cameras stopped rolling. And perhaps that is why the footage keeps resurfacing, not because it answers all the questions, but because it dares to ask a few that still do not have answers. Because if John Wayne, the man who seemed so unshakable, could carry doubt, contradiction, and quiet regret, what does that mean for the rest of us? And what else have we missed, simply because we never looked close enough? Even after his death, John Wayne remained a lightning rod. He had spent decades building his legacy, brick by brick, with his films, his public persona, and his unmistakable voice. But once he was gone, that legacy took on a life of its own. Suddenly, everyone had their own version of John Wayne. For some, he was the gold standard of patriotism and moral strength. For others, he was a relic, outdated, inflexible, a symbol of a time long gone. The truth, he was neither, and both. In the years following his death, Wayne's name was invoked in political debates, cultural arguments, even academic lectures. Entire books were written about what he supposedly stood for. His image was etched onto coffee mugs, campaign ads, and internet memes. But the man himself, the one who sat in that quiet interview and admitted his doubts, his mistakes, and his weariness, was nowhere to be found in any of it. Even his family noticed. In a rare public statement, one of his children said, "If people are going to use his name, they should at least understand who he really was." The estate had to push back more than once when his image was attached to ideas or causes he had never supported. Because that was the final contradiction of his life. He had full control of his image while he lived, but in death, he became something else entirely. A canvas others could paint on. And that is why the interview matters. Because it captured the one thing no movie ever could, the human being beneath the silhouette. The quiet recognition that no one, not even a legend, can fully control how they are remembered. The camera fades, the interview ends, and the world keeps spinning. But somehow, that quiet conversation still lingers. For decades, John Wayne was seen as a fixed point, a man who never bent, never wavered, never changed. He was the cowboy who always did what was right, even when it was hard. The war hero who stood tall while others hesitated, the father figure, the patriot, the myth. But what that rare interview revealed, in moments barely longer than a breath, was that John Wayne was just as human as the rest of us. Flawed, proud, wounded, searching. He had his convictions, and he held them tightly, but he also had regrets, doubts, and maybe even a quiet hope that someone, someday, would understand the weight he carried. And maybe that is what made him great. Not just the image, but the man beneath it, the one who fought to hold it all together, the one who gave more of himself to the role than anyone ever asked, the one who, in a single interview, left behind something more lasting than any performance. Not a confession, not an apology, just the truth, wrapped in silence, framed in pauses, and delivered with the kind of worn-down honesty that only comes at the end of a long road. You do not have to agree with everything he said. You do not have to love every film he made. But once you see that version of John Wayne, the one hidden between the lines, you can never unsee it. And maybe, just maybe, that is the most powerful role he ever played.